All right, good evening. Welcome to Spring Feast of the Lord. This is Spring Feast Part 2. And tonight we're going to be going over the counting of the Omer, which are the sheaves, and Shavuot, which is the Feast of Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks. All right, we'll open with a quote. It says, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me." It's Exodus 20, verses 2 and 3. And the one who said that was the Lord. All right, let's keep that momentum going, right? That he's the one that's speaking this. This isn't man speaking. Going over the recap of the last class, which is Spring Feast Part 1, I introduced a recurring theme that the feasts are designed to prepare us for marriage to our Messiah. And Shavuot happens to be the intro to the marriage contract and the terms, seeing what he wants to share with us from the perspective of what his holiness is and what it is to serve him. He starts giving us more details during this feast. I also introduced a method of study called the Kingdom Approach, and from Romans 14:17, righteousness, peace, and joy, which I am associating righteousness with the written word, peace with spiritual warfare, and joy as the regathering of Israel. And how we're defining the regathering of Israel, it is specifically the tribes of Israel that were regathered or that were together during the reign of King David and Solomon. And then the northern house, there were 10 tribes that were on the north that were cut off, and they were divorced and cut off, but they did get grafted back in the book of Acts, and we'll start seeing that evidence. The southern kingdom was Judah, Benjamin, and the Levites, which are the modern-day Jewish people. The northern house happens to be a scattered people that gets relabeled as the nations or Gentiles, but we know, according to the New Testament writings, that we are no longer Gentiles. We are in Messiah, and we've been regathered and restored. We also went over Passover, first fruits, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That was from the last class we had on June 11th. So this class, we have the counting of the Omer and Shavuot, Feast of Weeks. And you can see the illustration on the next slide there is the counting of the Omer, and Shavuot is going to be with 2 loaves, and we'll get into that, and we'll read something further in that. And make note that there are some scriptural associations I will be making. Some of it's not so direct, but I'll be introducing some ideas about the 10 Commandments being associated with this Feast of Weeks. We will get into where the story left off. The last time we were discussing this was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Israelites were leaving Egypt, and they were packing up, about to leave, and we read a lot from Exodus 12. So Exodus 13 is the next chapter. The Israelites were leaving Egypt. The Israelites came out of Egypt, and you can see in the top left, the area was Goshen. Does everybody see that? It's the green area. So the traditional route of the Israelites says that they went through the area outside of Goshen and went south in the wilderness of Sin, this is what they were relabeling, and that Mount Sinai is in the Sinai Peninsula. Most of your Bible maps will say this, right? Okay, that's why I'm calling it, this is the traditional viewpoint. And then the red line shows the path of the Israelites going up and all the way around up to the Promised Land. So I have to introduce the traditional view so that we can look at what I believe is the biblical account. The Israelites left the green area, which is Goshen. Then they go through the path where they go through the wilderness, and then they come to a stop right where, see where they're crossing there? So there is an area called Nueva Beach, and it's an area that happens to look very possible that you could fit a few million people there waiting to cross the Red Sea. Now, this is information that was uncovered by an archaeologist, or I guess amateur archaeologist. He had different titles. His name's Ron Wyatt. There are other people that have followed up and verified his work, Jim and Penny Caldwell, and then you have Joel Richardson, who's been made this very well known, And now there's another gentleman, and I'll give you the information here shortly, who's also compiled all this. And they're all verifying this account. They're going, if somehow, there has to be proof or evidence that millions of people left Egypt. And so far, the basic story about Mount Sinai and the traditional site, there's a monastery there, St. Catherine's Monastery. Who's ever heard of that before? Yeah. I guess there's a monument there that was established in the 4th century. It's really simply put. That had ties to Emperor Constantine, who decided that that's where they wanted Mount Sinai. So they built a monastery there, and that's what they said. And we've kind of gone along with it. Yeah. But here in the last 50 years or so, there have been different people trying to look at where the truth is. So I'm submitting this to you as a point of view that I believe is more of a biblical account. I believe everyone is compelled and empowered to verify this, and I'll provide the resources in the email after and the YouTube recap. So the crossing of the Red Sea seems a little bit more possible than going across that area and then going into Horeb or Mount Sinai, which today in Saudi Arabia is called Jebel al-Lawz, or they'll also call it Jebel Musa, which means Mountain of Moses. And even in the Arabic culture, they acknowledge it. Right now it's closed off. I believe it's still closed off. In some of the recent documentaries, they have been able to get drones in and take aerial footage of some of the evidence found. So if we're looking at evidence, we're saying, well, what exactly would we be looking for? Wouldn't there be some kind of evidence that there would be people encamped somewhere, or perhaps what happened at Mount Sinai with a golden calf? What about when they were thirsty? Didn't Moses strike a rock and didn't it split in two? Wouldn't there be evidence of that in the Sinai Peninsula? And I'll just cut to the chase and say, well, there isn't really anything like that in the Sinai Peninsula at St. Catherine's Monastery. There really isn't. I haven't been there. I've had people that have been there have came back and said they didn't really see any of that there. That's the Nuweiba Beach Red Sea crossing. That's right before Saudi Arabia. So that looks a lot more realistic, that you would have them all waiting there before the Red Sea was going to part in two. And those mountains there were shielding them from the Egyptians chasing them. So you could see that they were there, and all of a sudden they saw and heard the Egyptian armies coming, and they had to cross the Red Sea. Only problem was, how are you going to get across there? So now the story becomes even more compelling. The miracle becomes even more powerful, that they cross this Red Sea that was parted in two. They crossed over. There's just some interesting photographs of the different mountains all throughout the Middle East, or that region, that this is really the only one that's black at the top. And I'm curious to see if you guys are putting this together yet. Why would it be black at the top? Seems like fire may have rained down on this mountain, right? So I'm just presenting the evidence. These are photos taken from different sources, and I'll give you more as we go along here. So this is Jebel al-Lawz, which is the possible location of Mount Sinai. And it's also referred to as the land of Midian. Who's ever heard of the land of Midian in the Bible times? That's where Moses fled to, okay? That's modern-day Saudi Arabia. We have a little bit more looking at the split rock at Rephidim, which is, that is where near Jebel al-Lawz, near the mountain. And some facts that I've learned over the years, that this region doesn't get a whole lot of rain. And for rocks to look as if there was some kind of a river there, it looks really smooth. The rocks there are very smooth, as if water flowed, which is an impossibility because it doesn't rain as often. So there you have a split rock, and it's still there. That's a modern photograph. That was not from ancient times, I promise. I'm not that good in finding the photos, right? In addition to that, nearby, there were drawings that resembled a cow or a calf at the same area. So there's the golden calf. We're kind of piecing this together, right? So I just kind of give you some thumbnails of a few YouTube videos, and I'll send out the links to you. One of them is called The Underground, Joel Richardson. He has a video YouTube series where he actually is on site, and he's able to give more insight into that. Jim and Penny Caldwell were recently on Prophecy Watchers. It's another show. And then you've got another gentleman who made a documentary, Mauro, the Mauro show, and that one's probably a little bit more in depth and gives all of the accounts that have come forward. So I really like all three. But again, if you just Google real Mount Sinai at this point, all sorts of stuff comes up. And there's even more. There's photos of Egyptian chariot wheels being found at the bottom of the Red Sea, and countless other things, little details I wish I had time to go into. But I wanted to at least give you the framework of this, that sometimes with tradition and traditional sites, they don't really add up. And it's our responsibility to go into a place of honesty and seeking His truth, but also being Spirit-led. So hopefully this brings another witness to you that you could verify for yourself. Because when I ran into this information in 2004, a lot of the footage was still very new. A lot of it was home video. I was at a screening in the Carolinas, North Carolina, one of the first times that Jim and Penny Caldwell presented their videos. They had hundreds of hours of footage. They worked for an American oil company in Saudi Arabia and happened to go into the site and take all this footage and photos, and so they released it. And so I was there in the early 2000s when a lot of that was being released. And it was very exciting. I mean, it's some of the first times we really saw a lot of this being verified. Prior to that, there were just theories. They were kind of, what ifs. And so it's exciting. This is exciting stuff, Have to make light of this just a little bit. So it says, so I'm going to Egypt to visit Mount Sinai. And then the response is, it's in Arabia like Paul said. Galatians 4:25, he says Mount Sinai is in Arabia. So there you have it. There's another witness there. And I'm pretty sure Arabia is still Arabia. I don't think they've changed that. We're going to get into counting the Omer. So this is where the verses are from Leviticus 23. And you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the Omer, the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. So the counting on the Omer, we know that 7 weeks must be completed. Follows the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is what we had in the last class we studied about. Then the counting began on the day after the weekly Sabbath. So it's the first day of the week, which is a Sunday. So you count 7 complete weeks from there. That's 49 days. Then you add 1, and that's 50. That's where we start getting the name or Pentecost, which is 50. So here we have now the Feast of Shavuot, a Feast of Weeks. And you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day after you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. Count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall offer a new grain offering to the Lord. And so you can see they would gather the sheaves in that image there in the bottom right. That's Leviticus 23, 15, and 16. And reading on to the next couple verses, he says, you shall bring from your dwellings 2 wave loaves of 2/10 of an ephah. So those are 2 loaves of bread. They shall be fine flour. They shall be baked with leaven. They are the first fruits to the Lord. And you shall offer with bread 7 lambs to the first year without blemish, 1 young bull and 2 rams, and they shall be as a burnt offering to the Lord, with their grain offering and their drink offering, an offering made by fire for a sweet aroma to the Lord. And we keep seeing this theme of fire in most of the feasts, but this one in particular. I think he really liked to display the fire in this one. So Feast of Shavuot is a one of a kind. We read in verses 9 through to 21. Then you shall sacrifice 1 kid, the goats of his sin offering, and 2 male lambs of the first year as a sacrifice of a peace offering. The priest shall wave them with the bread of the first fruits as a wave offering before the Lord. With the 2 lambs they shall be holy to the Lord for the priest. And you shall proclaim on the same day that it is a holy convocation to you. You shall do no customary work, and it shall be a statute forever in all your dwellings throughout your generations. So there it is. Pretty simple stuff. You take part of the sheaves that you were counting 50 of them, You use that to make the bread. You bring a sacrifice as was usually required. And there's a rejoicing, there's a waving of it. Feast of Shavuot, also in the New Testament. When the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all in one accord in one place, and suddenly there came a sound from heaven as a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. Then there appeared to them divided tongues of fire, and one sat upon each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Now you see the origins and the beginnings and where it came from. So how is it that they knew to gather at this time? Well, they had instructions in Acts chapter 1 when Yeshua was with them for 40 days and he instructed them to go to the appointed time. It was about 10 days later, and they knew where to gather and when to gather, and that's why on the feast day he shows up. We're looking at the timeline here. I've got two images there of the Ten Commandments and another image of fire on a mountain. It's best I could put it, right? This is quite an enormous event. Acts chapter 2 was also incredibly significant. So we've got a connection here. And I'll just submit to you that the connection here with the Ten Commandments and the Feast of Weeks, it's not so apparent in the scriptures, in the book of Exodus. If you look at the timeline when they left Egypt, it was about 7 weeks later when Moses went up on the mountain and when the Ten Commandments were presented. There was some other times there where Moses, because he saw what was going on at the base of the mountain, then the tablets were broken and he goes back up and gets another. But nevertheless, there is a connection, I believe, and I'll submit to you, with the giving of the Ten Commandments, because Acts chapter 2 gives a really strong witness to something being given in a very similar manner. So in Exodus 19, it says, in verses 16 through 20, then it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunderings and lightning and a thick cloud on the mountain, and the sound of the trumpet was very loud. It sounds like the mighty and rushing wind, right? That's trumpet. There is also a ram's horn or shofar. So that all the people who were in the camp trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God. And they stood at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was completely in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace. The whole mountain quaked greatly. And the blast of the trumpet sounded longer and became louder and louder. Moses spoke, and God answered him by voice. And the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai at the top of the mountain. And the Lord called to Moses on the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. So here's the first occurrence of there being an encounter with the God of Israel. With fire, with sound. So we see Yeshua, Jesus, using these same type of words in Acts chapter 1. That you were baptized with water, and now this time you're being baptized with fire. They're sending the Comforter. So there's our connection. And now we look at the actual Ten Commandments. So we call them 10 commandments. They are also referred to as the 10 words, 10 declarations, or 10 words rather. There are 3 different ways of counting them, depending on what background you have. If there's a Jewish background, some of the Jewish sources will start with, I am the Lord your God who is taking you out of Egypt. The Catholic source will say, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. And then the Protestant or Christian side will say, you shall have no other gods before me, and that's where they start. And so that's where the 10 Commandments, as they broken up, that's the 10 words that were spoken that they all heard. They are all witnesses to this. They all heard this. So this is the foundation of the Hebrew people and all of the tribes of Israel, and now us in modern day. So it goes on. Don't have any of the gods before me. You shall not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. Honor your mother and father. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. I'd like to introduce the parallels with Exodus 20 and Acts chapter 2. So in doing comparison to these, both occurred near a mountain. Exodus 20 occurred in Mount Sinai. Acts chapter 2 occurred near Mount Zion in Jerusalem. Both involve newly redeemed people. The Israelites were drawn out of Egypt. The disciples of Yeshua in the Acts chapter 2 were newly introduced to the salvation of Yeshua's death and resurrection. Very similar dynamic there. Both involved fire and sound and fire. 10 commandments, cloven tongues of fire. You see that? So according to Exodus 32, the incident with the golden calf, 3,000 people died as a result of breaking covenant with the golden calf incident. In Acts chapter 2, verse 41, 3,000 people were brought to covenant after the Holy Spirit was poured out. I don't think there's any coincidence in that number. All right? There's a restoration there, and it had to do with covenant. It had to do with those who broke covenant, and then now here's a restoration of 3,000. It's quite a few people. Some spiritual warfare insight that I like introducing with every feast. As I've mentioned before, I've had some spiritual experiences where I saw a pattern of the feast with areas of sin, and this feast happens to be associated with bitterness from my personal experience and studies. So one of the things that we see when the Israelites left Egypt, what was it they encountered? The bitter waters. Exodus 15. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. And he cried to the Lord, Moses did, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it in the water, and it became sweet. And there the Lord made for them a statute and a rule that where he tested them. So there is an illustration there of bitterness. And this is a really deep subject that many people during the feast time, when you're trying to prepare your heart to receive his covenant, one of the things that really begins to defile us, our soul, our mind, will, emotions, and memory, is a root of bitterness. And a lot of it has to do with unforgiveness or unresolved issues that we may bring from our childhood, from relationships. We also see Acts chapter 2. There was a backdrop of bitterness there. When they were filled with the Holy Spirit, some were mocking and saying, they must be filled with new wine. How is it that they could make this judgment, this sarcastic, this mockery of a movement that was clearly God's Spirit being poured out? How is it that the Israelites, in the same manner, could make such a mockery with the golden calf and call that golden calf a God that brought us out? This is what brought us out of Egypt, right? This is what we're seeing that it manifests very strongly. We're going to look at some of the roots here on where the word begins to unravel this and why it's so important as we prepare ourselves for marriage. In Leviticus 19, and there's a specific reason why I'm highlighting this, because this section in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, just a quick overview, the first 5 books of the Bible were not broken up into books and chapters and verses originally. Okay, that's a very modern thing. And some of you here in the audience are more experienced with that. You'd say it's probably less than 500-600 years old. Well, we're breaking up in chapter and verses, right? So then at this point, it's one scroll. It's one collection of writings. The section, the first 5 books, which was one scroll, was broken up into 54 sections. This was during the Second Temple era, a little before when Yeshua walked the earth. So, this section in Leviticus 19 happens to be called Kedoshim, which is holiness. So when you're dialoguing with those who are learned in the scriptures, when you refer to this section, and it's a few chapters long, and you say, in the section Kedoshim, or holiness, you automatically know, oh, the famous words, love your neighbor as yourself. And there's 54 of them. So many times when I'm dialoguing with people from around the world that have been studying some of these perspectives, if I start referring to another section, a very famous section is called Hazinu, which is Moses' last address. where he just lays it all out and prophesies and says, you're going to be disobedient, you're going to be scattered, things are going to come upon you. And so we all know when you say hazinu, which means to give ear, that's a pretty serious section, and so on and so forth. So when you look at the New Testament, many times Paul's writings will make these references, and you'll have to just know that's where he's coming from. It is believed that Paul, the Apostle Paul, had the majority of the scriptures memorized, the first half of the book, or at least the Torah, for the level of study that he was at. So you'd think someone that learned, that scholarly, would immediately be able to point you and quickly tell you this section, and give you insight. So with that, in Leviticus 19, verses 17 through 18, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Those are pretty famous words. Someone else also quoted, right? You see that. Hebrews chapter 12. The author, which many would say perhaps is Paul, it may be Barnabas. I happen to believe it was inspired or written by Paul. Chapter 12, verses 14 and 15. It says, strive for peace with everyone, and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness spring up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. There is a lot of references to the first half of the book in just those two verses. I could spend an hour just in all the references there. But the first line points you back to that section called holiness. Kedushim. Strive for peace with everyone. That's the whole point of love your neighbor as yourself. Don't harbor hatred for your brother. What is it all talking about? It's talking about bitterness. And then he gives a direct reference. Don't let the root of bitterness spring up. He knew the Israelites, both those who were being grafted in, the northern house that was coming and returning, were going to have a lot of different issues they were working through. But this letter was addressed to the Hebrews, to the Messianic Jewish people. And the author, which I believe is Paul, was dealing with some very specific issues. How hard was it for them to accept their brother? It was very difficult for them, because you had people coming into faith that were completely unfaithful. And you see in the book of Acts, there were thousands coming in with all sorts of different traditions and things, right? So now, today, we see a very similar thing with those who are growing up in the scriptures, who are in church settings, who are learning his word. For instance, here at Rock City, you guys, here are nurtured. You guys have lots of insights into these areas of sin, into bitterness, inner healing, spiritual warfare, the moves of the Spirit. You guys are walking in these things. And if your hearts aren't prepared, I suppose the root of bitterness could sprout up. And then you would look at those who are not quite living their life correctly with hatred, with suspect, with disdain, with all kinds of different attitudes, right? We see also an association that the living Word, the Word made flesh, Yeshua, in Matthew 5, happens to be teaching some more in-depth about the Ten Commandments. So the Beatitudes, as he was addressing the multitudes, and seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and he taught them. And then in verse 44, you go further down. I'm giving one example here. You have heard that it is said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. And pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. What Yeshua is laying the groundwork for here is to eradicate bitterness from the camp. To make sure that there is forgiveness. Because one of the first warning signs of there being bitterness or that root coming up is unforgiveness. So when we're unable to forgive one another, there are other things that follow. Resentment and all kinds of different things that would affect. And that's why Hebrews 12 talks, it says it will defile us. Here's another example of bitterness speaking, coming in to test, similar to the test that we just referred to with the bitter waters. So Matthew 22. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Interesting, right? Teacher. It almost sounds a bit sarcastic, right? Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And Yeshua, and he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. And this is the great and first commandment. And the second is like, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depends the whole law, the Torah, and the prophets. This was a very heavy statement. This is not something that just anyone can piece together. In fact, the way he responded to this lawyer, he already assumed this lawyer knew what sections he was quoting. And there were two sections that Yeshua was quoting from the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. That is in Deuteronomy 6:4, where it says, "Hear, O Israel." And he's assuming that you know already the prerequisite for love is to hear. The word in Hebrew is Shema. And that word is much more than just hear. It refers to hear, do, and obey. So that's why words in Hebrew carry a little bit more weight than we associate them in English. It's just the way it works. That's why I believe Hebrew is the divine tongue. It's the tongue of angels. It's got much more meaning and deeper things. So I encourage you to continue doing Hebrew word studies and looking into these things, because it really helps your faith and encourage you to look at the roots of these. So as he responded to the lawyer, he says, Shema. He's referring to that section. You're supposed to already know. Similar to right now, if I began to sing some kind of a cultural song, I don't know, Yankee Doodle or something, you guys would know the words and go, okay, you don't need to finish Yankee Doodle. I know the words to it, right? I know that's kind of a light cultural reference, but you get the picture. This was embedded in the Hebrew culture, in the Jewish culture. So he's responding with, you should already know this, the two greatest. Because the framework of love, you can't have it without Shema, without hear, doing, and obeying. Then you love him with all your heart, soul, and mind. In fact, today, it really is like a national anthem in Israel. Well, they'll start off and they'll say Shema Yisrael. And it's a prayer that is done 3 times a day. And they'll go into, it's quite a few verses that they'll recite. But the love your neighbor as yourself part is found in some of the more Messianic Jewish prayers. And that's something that I also incorporate and I say in my prayers. So to say that the Torah and the prophets, that the first 5 books and all the words of the prophet hang on these things, it's giving you a clear indication that the way that this lawyer started off with sarcasm, with cynicism, with mockery, has to be overturned. And it won't be overturned unless there's obedience, unless there's humility, honor, respect, love. That's why we see with the depths of love in the famous Corinthians 13, this is love is patient, love is kind, right? Well, we know when there are people that manifest impatience, where's love? That person has no problem at that point. Once patience is out the window, other things come in, such as sarcasm, cynicism, mockery. I was just joking. Don't take it so personal, right? But behind those empty words, there is truth to that. Out of the abundance of the heart, man speaks, right? So how is it that bitterness can have such free reign to speak through us? When we're studying the cultural aspects, we're looking at the Israelites leaving Egypt But yet they engaged in a level of bitterness was quite arguably some of the worst that's ever been seen in recorded history, with all the miracles that they saw. And they still complained about the water. They built a golden calf. And they did countless other things, uprisings, accusations towards Moses. Even his own sister engaged in a level of bitterness. So we see that it can come into the camp quickly. So Hebrews 12 is giving us another warning, that root of bitterness, once it springs up. So you have to pursue peace. That means it's actively, you have to move towards it, and you have to pursue peace. Because these things will come in an instant. So how is it, tying this all back into marriage, what would happen? Because bitterness is one of the what we see scripturally. If there can't be forgiveness between husband and wives, then there won't be forgiveness with communities built, or that the communities and congregations, local bodies that have marriages. What lesson are marriages learning? What lesson are we learning as the bride of Messiah? Can we forgive one another? And so this is an ongoing thing. It's an active thing. It would be much easier, I'm sure, to one day you say, okay, I follow you, I give my life to you, Lord, and everything is just fine. It doesn't. The enemy comes to kill, steal, destroy. He comes to tempt us. So we have a responsibility as believers, as followers of him. So the 10 Commandments could be given. You could be hearing all the instructions. He wants to write it on our heart. But if we aren't ready for that, because our mind, will, emotions, and memory, our soul is still defiled with sarcasm, with bitterness, with cynicism, with disbelief, what happens then? Will we be a bride that's willing to obey and to wait for our Heavenly Father as He comes in to marry us here? And that's, in the latter days. So the feast, this one in particular, starts giving the details of the marriage contract. The 10 Commandments happens to be part of the framework. Then it gets even more specific. That's why when Yeshua's teaching in Matthew 5, he's giving even more details. He's shedding light on something even further in this direction. So the lesson here, it's not just about counting sheaves. It's not the outward expression. It's not about waving 2 loaves. Because there's a part in the prophets that I'll have to highlight later on, I most likely will, where even God himself says, I don't care about your feasts. See, if your heart's not right, I could care less. And that's a serious thing to consider, because these are his feasts. But he also could just as easily say, if your heart is defiled, if your heart is engaged in this, what's the point? So here we go. After Passover, he redeems the bride. We leave Egypt. Shavuot, Feast of Weeks. He's starting to provide the marriage contract. In the next class, we're going to start getting into the beginnings of the fall feasts, where he will begin to regather us in the leading up to the marriage feast. So I want to encourage everybody here that this walk, this path that you're on to serve your Heavenly Father, and that you have the Holy Spirit, that you have received these things. Another big parallel that I wish I had a little more time for. I see a parallel with the fruits of the Spirit and the 10 Commandments. That there's something there that has been taught, and I'll submit to you a really important idea, something that I've learned recently. For ages, I think that there have been lots of philosophical, man-made ideas about virtues, about good works. How easy would it be to say the fruits of the Spirit are like virtues that you should live up to or attain? And it sounds like a pretty good idea, but in fact, it's not biblical. Because when Yeshua died, he rose from the dead, our inheritance becomes all of those things. When exactly do we see that transformation in somebody? It's not when you make some commitment and out of obligation or because you grew up. It's when someone wholeheartedly says, "No, I will follow," and you have that transformational experience, right? So at that point, all those fruits of the Spirit, all of those things are your inheritance. So if you happen to manifest impatience, because the first fruit of the Spirit listed in Galatians is love, right? Well, if there's impatience that's manifested, you could see, I don't want to participate with this. I want to completely disassociate myself with manifesting this impatience, this bitterness that's behind it, whatever's lurking there. So versus these things being taught as virtues, as something you have to attain, that you have to work towards, I'll submit to you that these are things that you already have because of your faith in Yeshua and what he did. And that continues to bring you back to that place of simplicity versus thinking that you have to do these works to attain it. Where if you follow that train of thought, that school of thought, it will frustrate you. You will grow bitter. You'll have some kind of unforgiveness towards yourself for not attaining these things, for not living perfectly. So this is all a warning, I think, that he's giving us through the feast to show us how serious these things are and that we already have them as an inheritance. There's a lot of teachings that we hear in the religious settings of being Christ-like. Well, I understand the idea, but if he's dwelling in us, he's already dwelling in us. And we are certainly renewed and restored. We are a new creation because of that. And so the feast allow us to see these things in different lights. Yes, the history is important. Yes, all of the different things that come with it are important. But more importantly, if we can eradicate bitterness from our mind, will, emotions, and memory, from our communities, from marriages, from our relationships, I believe that will lead us to a path where we can truly hear, do, and obey and love one another and him with all of our heart, soul, and being.